The summer of 1856 arrived at Blackwood Plantation in southern Mississippi like a suffocating blanket soaked in sweat and dread. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, and the air hung thick with humidity that made every breath feel like drowning on dry land. Josiah had worked these fields since he was 7 years old. 23 years of calloused hands, bent backs, and dreams that died before they could take root. But before we descend into this haunting tale of survival and vengeance, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here at Twisted of Fate, consider subscribing, because stories like Josiah's deserve to be told, remembered, and never forgotten. Now, prepare yourself for a journey through darkness that will test everything you think you know about justice, mercy, and the price of survival. Josiah wiped the sweat from his brow and straightened his aching back just long enough to see the overseer, Dutch Calloway, riding his horse along the edge of the field. Dutch was a thin man with a cruel mouth and eyes like pale blue ice, the kind of man who smiled when he whipped you. Josiah quickly returned to picking, his fingers moving with mechanical efficiency. "Keep moving, boy!" Dutch shouted, though Josiah was 30 years old. "Master Blackwood don't pay you niggers to stand around." Josiah's wife, Esther, worked 3 rows over. Even bent in the oppressive heat, she was beautiful to him. They'd been married in the slave way, jumping the broom 2 years ago, with old Samuel speaking words over them that weren't legal, but meant everything to those who witnessed it. That evening, as the enslaved people trudged back to their quarters, Josiah noticed old Samuel stumbling. The man who'd married them was swaying, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Samuel?" Josiah caught his elbow. "You all right?" "Just tired, son. Just so tired." But it wasn't tiredness. Josiah could feel the heat radiating from Samuel's body. The old man was burning with fever. "Esther! Help me get him to his cabin." They carried Samuel inside and laid him down. Esther pressed her hand to his forehead and looked at Josiah with worry creasing her brow. "Fever," she whispered. "Bad one." By morning, Samuel wasn't the only one sick. 3 more people woke with the same symptoms: burning fever, violent chills, vomiting. By afternoon, 7. By nightfall, 12. The fever spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, and Master Edmund Blackwood, sitting in his grand house with its white columns and crystal chandeliers, did absolutely nothing. Josiah stood outside Samuel's cabin on the 3rd night, listening to labored breathing all around. People were moaning, crying out in delirium, children whimpering for mothers too sick to comfort them. "We need medicine," Esther said quietly, appearing beside him. She'd been up for 2 days straight, moving from cabin to cabin with nothing but cool water and damp cloths. "Master Blackwood won't send for a doctor," Josiah said bitterly. "Not for us. Then we'll die." Esther's voice was flat, exhausted. "This isn't just fever. This is something worse." By the end of the week, 4 people were dead. By the end of the 2nd week, 9. The fever took Samuel, whose last words were a blessing. It took little Ruth, only 5 years old, who used to laugh when Josiah carved her wooden animals. And still, from the big house on the hill, Edmund Blackwood did nothing. Josiah began noticing something else. Dutch Calloway and the other overseers had stopped coming close. They shouted orders from horseback now, never dismounting. How slaves were kept separated. Food was left at the edge of the quarters. They were being quarantined, sealed off, left to die. "They're afraid," Josiah told Esther one night. "They're leaving us here to burn it out." Esther turned to him in the darkness. "We have to survive this, Josiah. There has to be something after all this suffering." He pulled her close. "I promise you," he whispered, "I will survive, whatever it takes." He didn't know how heavy that promise would become. The fever came for Esther 2 days later. Josiah knew the moment he woke up. Esther's body radiated heat like a furnace, and her beautiful eyes were glazed with fever, staring at nothing. "No," he whispered, "not you. Please, God, not you." But if God was listening, he didn't answer. Esther's fever climbed throughout the day. By nightfall she was delirious, calling out names of people long dead, crying for her mother who'd been sold away when Esther was a child. The quarters had become a graveyard. More than 30 people were dead, and 20 more were sick. The living moved like ghosts, exhausted beyond measure, trying to care for the dying with nothing, no medicine, no doctors, no help. Josiah left Esther only once, walking through darkness to the edge of the quarters where their world ended and the white world began. He could see lights in the big house windows, warm and golden. He imagined the Blackwood family inside, safe and healthy and completely indifferent to the suffering a quarter-mile away. Something broke in Josiah that night, something fundamental that could never be repaired. He'd spent his entire life accepting bondage, accepting cruelty, accepting that his life had no value. But watching Esther die, knowing a simple doctor's visit could save her, knowing medicine existed just out of reach, while Edmund Blackwood sat comfortable with expensive whiskey, the acceptance died. What replaced it was something colder, harder, something that would keep him alive long after he wanted to die. Esther passed 3 days later, in the grey hour before dawn. Her last words were, "I love you," whispered so quietly Josiah almost missed them. He held her as her breathing slowed, stopped, and then she was gone. Josiah didn't cry. He was beyond tears. He carried Esther's body to the mass grave at the far end of the quarters, a long trench in red Mississippi clay where fever victims were laid side by side. No individual graves, no markers, no names, just the forgotten, dumped together and buried shallow. He laid Esther down gently, arranged her hands the way she used to sleep, and stood there as others brought their dead. 47 people total would go into that grave, 47 souls reduced to an inconvenience to be buried and forgotten. "I will remember you," Josiah said quietly, "every single one of you. I will remember, and I will make them remember too." The fever burned itself out after that. No new cases appeared. Those who'd been sick either died or started recovering. Josiah never got sick, not even a sniffle. He'd been exposed more than anyone, but the fever passed him by like he was invisible. Sometimes, in the dark nights that followed, he wondered if that was the cruelest mercy of all. When it was over, 47 of 83 enslaved people at Blackwood Plantation were dead, more than half, an entire community decimated, and from the big house there was no acknowledgement, no recognition, no apology. 3 days after they'd buried the dead, Dutch Calloway rode back into the quarters. "All right," he shouted, his horse dancing nervously. "Fever's done. You niggers get back to work tomorrow. Master Blackwood's been patient enough, but that cotton ain't gonna pick itself." Patient enough, as if they'd been taking a vacation, as if 47 people hadn't died while he watched from a safe distance. Josiah stood among the survivors, 36 broken, traumatized people who'd just buried their families, and something crystallized in his mind. A terrible clarity that cut through grief like a blade through silk. This would not stand. This would not be forgotten. The debt owed for those 47 lives would be paid, one way or another. Dutch seemed to sense something, because his eyes narrowed as he looked at Josiah. "You got something to say, boy?" Josiah met his gaze and let silence answer. Let Dutch see nothing but submission and grief. Let him think the fever had broken them completely. "Didn't think so," Dutch sneered. "Tomorrow, dawn, fields." He rode away, and Josiah turned back to look at the mass grave. The red clay was fresh, still settling. In a few months, grass would grow over it. In a few years, you wouldn't know anything had happened here at all, unless someone remembered, unless someone made sure they were never forgotten. Josiah made a decision that would change everything. But the fields felt different after the fever. Every row Josiah walked, every plant he touched, carried the ghost of someone who should have been there. Samuel's laugh, Ruth's singing, Esther's presence 3 rows over, all gone, replaced by silence and the mechanical movements of 36 survivors doing the work of 83. Master Blackwood solved his labor problem the only way he knew how. He bought more slaves. Within 2 weeks, a coffle of 21 people arrived, chained together and exhausted from the long walk from the auction house in Natchez. Fresh bodies to replace the dead ones, as simple as replacing a broken tool. Josiah watched them arrive and felt nothing. The part of him capable of feeling empathy for suffering had died with Esther. Now there was only the plan, forming slowly in the dark spaces of his mind, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Among the new arrivals was a man named Marcus, tall and powerfully built, with tribal scars on his cheeks that marked him as African-born. He'd been separated from his family at auction, and the grief in his eyes was still fresh and raw. Josiah recognized that grief, knew exactly how it felt. "You're the one who survived the fever," Marcus said to him one evening, his accent thick but his English clear. "They say you nursed the sick and never caught it yourself." "I survived," Josiah said flatly. "That's all." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Why did you survive when so many died?" It was the question Josiah asked himself every night. Why had death passed him by? Why had he been spared when Esther, who was good and kind and deserved to live, had been taken? "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm going to make it mean something." Marcus studied him carefully. "You're planning something. I can see it in your eyes." Josiah should have denied it, should have shut down the conversation immediately. But something in Marcus's gaze, the same cold fury that Josiah felt burning in his own chest, made him speak truth instead. "The people who died in the fever," Josiah said quietly. "They're buried in a mass grave at the edge of the quarters. No names, no markers. Master Blackwood and his overseers sealed us off and let us die like animals. 47 people, 47 souls forgotten the moment they stopped working. And you want revenge," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "I want justice," Josiah corrected. "I want the world to remember what happened here. I want Edmund Blackwood to pay for every life he let die." "Justice and revenge look the same from where we're standing," Marcus observed. "How do you plan to do this?" Josiah had been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over in his mind during the endless hours in the fields. Blackwood Plantation was isolated, surrounded by forest and swamp. The nearest neighbors were 5 miles away. The house sat on a hill, but it was a wooden structure, old, dry. "Fire," Josiah said simply. "Fire and witnesses. I want people to see what happened here. I want Blackwood to answer for it." "Fire kills everyone," Marcus pointed out, "including us. Not if we're ready, not if we have a plan." Josiah met his gaze. "I'm not asking you to help. I'm not asking anyone. This is my burden." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My wife's name was Amma. My son was Kofi. They were sold 3 days ago to different plantations. I'll never see them again. If you're going to make Blackwood answer for his sins, then you're making all these devils answer. I'll help." Over the following weeks, 2 more joined them. Caleb, a field hand who'd lost his daughter to the fever, and May, a house slave who'd been beaten so many times, her back was a map of scars. They moved carefully, speaking only in the briefest moments, planning in whispers. The plan was simple. Wait for a dry spell, wait until the Blackwood family was hosting one of their gatherings, when witnesses would be present. Start a fire in the barn that would spread to the house. Create chaos. And in that chaos, escape into the swamp where the hounds couldn't track them. But Josiah had one more element to the plan, something he shared with no one. Before they ran, before they disappeared into the swamp, he would make sure people knew why. He would make sure the story of the 47 forgotten souls was told. He would make sure Edmund Blackwood's name was forever linked to the plague he'd ignored and the people he'd left to die. The opportunity came in late September, when the air turned crisp and the cotton was nearly harvested. Master Blackwood announced he'd be hosting a dinner for neighboring plantation owners, a celebration of another profitable year. The house would be full of Mississippi's finest white families, all complicit in the same system that had murdered Esther and 46 others, perfect witnesses for what was coming. 2 nights before the dinner, Josiah stood at the mass grave in the darkness, speaking to Esther one last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry for what I'm about to become. But I made you a promise. I will survive, and I will make them remember." The wind moved through the trees, and for just a moment Josiah could have sworn he heard Esther's voice. "Then survive, my love, and when you're done, find a way to live." Boom! The evening of September 28th, 1856, was perfect, cool and dry, with a breeze that carried the scent of honeysuckle and wood smoke. Carriages began arriving at Blackwood Plantation just after sunset, bringing Mississippi's plantation elite in their finest clothes, women in silk dresses and men in expensive suits, all of them profiting from the same system of human bondage, all of them complicit. Josiah watched from the shadows near the barn, his heart beating steady and cold. This was it, the moment when everything would change, when the forgotten would be remembered, when Edmund Blackwood would finally pay his debt. Marcus appeared beside him, silent as a ghost. "Caleb and May are ready. The barn's full of dry hay. It'll go up fast. The guests are all inside?" "Everyone. 23 people total, including the Blackwood family." Marcus paused. "You're sure about this?" Josiah thought of Esther's last breath, thought of Samuel and Ruth and the 44 others in that nameless grave. "I'm sure." They moved quickly. Caleb had already prepared the barn, stacking hay near the walls, leaving gaps for air to feed the flames. May had stolen lamp oil from the house, precious liquid that would turn a small fire into an inferno. Josiah carried a torch, fire dancing in the darkness. "When I light this," he said to the three of them, "we run for the swamp. Don't stop, don't look back. The confusion will cover us, but only for a little while. Once they realize what's happening, the hounds will come." "What about the story?" Marcus asked. "You said you wanted people to know why." Josiah pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt, words he'd carefully carved with a stolen pencil stub over many nights. "This stays. Someone will find it. Someone will read it." He'd written 47 names, every person who died in the fever, and beneath them a single sentence: "Master Edmund Blackwood left us to die. Remember us." He weighted the paper with a stone near the edge of the quarters, visible but not obvious. Someone would find it. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. The dead would be named, would be remembered. "Time," Marcus said quietly. Josiah touched the torch to the oil-soaked hay. For a moment, nothing happened. Then flame caught, spread, bloomed into bright orange fury that climbed the barn walls like a living thing. The dry wood caught instantly, and within seconds the entire structure was engulfed. "Go!" Josiah shouted. They ran. Behind them the fire roared, and shouts of alarm rose from the big house. Josiah heard Dutch Calloway's voice bellowing orders, heard the screams of women and the crash of people fleeing the dinner party in panic. He didn't look back. Just ran, his legs pumping, following the path they'd scouted through the woods toward the deep swamp where the hounds couldn't track. Behind them, Blackwood Plantation burned. The fire spread faster than Josiah had anticipated. The dry September air fed it, and the wind carried embers to the house itself. He heard more screaming, heard the crack of timber, heard chaos consuming everything the Blackwoods had built on the backs of enslaved people. They ran for an hour before stopping deep in the swamp, where cypress trees rose from dark water and Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds. Josiah's lungs burned, his legs trembled, but they were alive. They were free. "We did it," May whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We actually did it." "We're not safe yet," Marcus warned. "They'll come looking. They'll hunt us." "Let them," Josiah said, looking back through the trees where an orange glow stained the night sky. "Let them try." They moved deeper into the swamp, following paths only locals knew, wading through water that would hide their scent from hounds. For 3 days they traveled, eating whatever they could find, drinking swamp water, moving always north towards something that might be freedom. On the 4th day, hiding in a hollow cypress while hounds bayed in the distance, Marcus turned to Josiah. "What now? We can't run forever." Josiah had been thinking about this. They weren't free. Not really. They were fugitives now, hunted with prices on their heads. 4 black people traveling alone would be captured or killed within weeks. "We need help," he said. "We need the railroad." The Underground Railroad, the network of abolitionists and freed blacks who helped escapees reach the North. It was dangerous, half myth and half reality, but it was their only chance. "How do we find them?" Caleb asked. "We head for Natchez. There's a church there, a preacher named Samuel Reed. He's sympathetic." Josiah had heard whispers, rumors passed in the quarters on long nights. If anyone can connect us to the railroad, it's him. They traveled at night, avoiding roads, living on scraps and determination. The world felt enormous and hostile, every sound a potential threat, every stranger a possible enemy. But they kept moving, driven by the same force that had kept Josiah alive through the fever, the simple, stubborn refusal to die. 2 weeks after the fire, they reached Natchez. Natchez sat along the Mississippi River like a jewel of commerce built on suffering. The city's wealth came from cotton, and cotton came from slave labor. The auction house where Marcus had lost his family stood in the city center, a reminder of the system they were fighting against. They reached the city after dark, 4 shadows moving through alleys, avoiding the main streets where patrols looked for runaway slaves. Samuel Reed's church was in the poorest part of town, a small wooden building with a leaning cross and windows covered in oilcloth instead of glass. Josiah approached alone first, leaving the others hidden. If this was a trap, no reason for all of them to be caught. He knocked on the side door using the pattern he'd been told. 3 quick, 2 slow, 3 quick. The door opened a crack, revealing a middle-aged black man with graying hair and careful eyes. "Yes? I'm looking for the River Jordan," Josiah said, using the code phrase. "I need to cross over." Samuel Reed's eyes widened slightly, then he pulled Josiah inside quickly. "How many?" "4 of us. We're from Blackwood Plantation, the one that burned." Recognition flashed across Reed's face. "Lord have mercy. That fire's been in every newspaper from here to Memphis. They're saying it was an accident, but I heard different. Heard it might have been rebellion." "It was justice," Josiah said flatly. "Edmund Blackwood left 47 of us to die in a fever. We made sure people would remember." Reed studied him for a long moment. "You started that fire?" "I did. You know what that means? You're not just a runaway now. You're something they fear. They'll hunt you with everything they have, then help us disappear." Reed was quiet, wrestling with the decision. Helping runaways was dangerous enough. Helping the people responsible for burning down one of Mississippi's prominent plantations, that was signing his own death warrant if they were caught. Finally, he nodded. "Bring your people, quickly." Within the hour, all 4 of them were hidden in Reed's church cellar, a small space beneath the floorboards where fugitives had hidden before. Reed brought them food, the first real meal they'd had in weeks, and water. "The railroad can move you," he said, "but it'll take time. Right now, every lawman and slave catcher in 3 states is looking for you. We need to let things cool down first." "How long?" Marcus asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3, then we can move you north, station by station, until you reach free soil." Free soil. The words sounded impossible, like something from a dream. "What happened after the fire?" May asked quietly. "Did anyone die?" Reed shook his head. "No deaths. The Blackwood family and their guests all escaped. The house burned to the ground, but they're alive." He paused. "They found something, though. A piece of paper with names on it. 47 names and an accusation against Master Blackwood." Josiah felt something loosen in his chest. The message had been found. The dead would be remembered. "What did the newspaper say?" he asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Reed said. "Some papers called it arson and rebellion, but others started asking questions. Why were 47 people dead? Why was there a mass grave? Some abolitionists picked up the story and started spreading it. Master Blackwood's trying to control the narrative, but the truth is slipping out. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete justice, but it was something. The forgotten were being remembered. Their names were entering the historical record, and Edmund Blackwood's reputation was being stained with the blood of those he'd let die. "There's something else," Reed continued, his expression grave. "The governor has put a bounty on your heads. $500 each alive, 1,000 for you, Josiah. They want to make an example of you. $2,000 total." It was more money than Josiah had ever imagined. Enough to turn friends into enemies. Enough to make even sympathetic people consider betrayal. "Then we need to move faster," Marcus said. "Can't," Reed replied. "Right now, they're expecting you to run north. Every road, every river crossing, every suspected railroad station is being watched. If we move you now, you'll be caught before you reach Tennessee. But if we wait, let them expand their search, thin out their resources, then we have a chance." So they waited. 2 weeks in a cellar, barely large enough for 4 people, listening to footsteps overhead, hearing the sounds of the city, wondering every moment if this would be when they were discovered. Reed brought them news from the outside world. The ongoing debate about the fire, the growing abolitionist interest in the Blackwood Plague, as it was being called. Esther's name was in the newspapers. Samuel's name, Ruth's name. All 47, printed and circulated and read by thousands of people who would never have known they existed otherwise. "They're not forgotten," Reed told Josiah. "Whatever else happens, you did that. You made sure they mattered." But mattering didn't feel like enough. Not when Esther was still dead, not when those 47 people were still in an unmarked grave, and Edmund Blackwood was still alive, free, and planning to rebuild. On the 15th night, Reed came to them with urgent news. "They're closing in. Someone talked, probably saw you coming into the city. We need to move you tonight, right now." "Where?" Josiah asked. "North. There's a station 30 miles from here, a farm owned by a Quaker family. They'll hide you and move you to the next station. From there it's 6 more stops to free soil. 6 stops. 6 chances to be caught, betrayed or killed. But it was their only option. They prepared to leave in darkness, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weight of everything they'd done. As they climbed out of the cellar, Reed pulled Josiah aside. "What you did, burning that plantation, making them remember the dead, it matters. But you need to understand something. The fight doesn't end when you reach the north. This system is bigger than one plantation, bigger than Edmund Blackwood. If you survive, if you make it to freedom, you have to keep fighting. Keep telling the story. Make sure those 47 names stay remembered." Josiah nodded. "I will, I promise." "Then go, and may God protect you." They disappeared into the Natchez night. 4 fugitives carrying the weight of justice on their backs, heading toward something that might be freedom. The 30 miles to the first railroad station took 3 nights of careful travel. They moved through forests and along creek beds, avoiding roads where patrols hunted for them. Every snapping twig, every distant shout, every barking dog sent adrenaline surging through Josiah's veins. They were prey now, and the entire South was hunting them. The Quaker farm appeared just before dawn on the 3rd night, a modest homestead with a barn and a small house, indistinguishable from hundreds of others, except for one detail, a lantern in the window, burning with a blue glass shade. The signal that they were expected. Josiah approached cautiously, his companions spread out behind him, ready to run if this was a trap. A figure emerged from the barn. A thin white woman in simple Quaker dress, her face weathered but kind. "Friends," she said quietly, "they are expected. Come quickly." Her name was Rachel Morris, and her family had been moving fugitives north for 12 years. She led them to the barn, where a false wall concealed a small room, barely 6 feet square, already occupied by 2 other escapees, a young couple who'd run from a plantation in Louisiana. "Thee will stay here 3 days," Rachel explained, bringing them food and water. "Then we move thee to the next station. The route north is being watched heavily because of the fire. Thee have made thyselves famous, and that makes the journey more dangerous." Famous. Josiah had never wanted fame. He'd wanted justice, wanted remembrance for the dead. But fame had come anyway, spreading their story across the South. Over the 3 days, Rachel brought them newspapers. The story of the Blackwood Fire had evolved into something larger than they'd imagined. Abolitionist papers in the North were calling it a justified rebellion against tyranny. Southern papers were calling it terrorism. Moderate papers were caught between, asking uncomfortable questions about the 47 dead and Edmund Blackwood's negligence. "Public opinion is divided," Rachel said, "but thee have accomplished something remarkable. The South is being forced to confront its own cruelty. That's dangerous for thee, but important for the cause." On the fourth night, they moved to the next station. A freed black family living on the edge of a small town, their house a waypoint in the invisible network leading north. Then another station. This one, a sympathetic white merchant who hid them in a wagon carrying supplies. Then another, a barn owned by freed blacks who fed them and told them stories of others who'd made the journey successfully. Each station brought them closer to Tennessee, closer to free soil. But each station also brought new dangers. At the fourth station, they arrived to find their contact nervous and frightened. "Slave catchers came through yesterday," he told them, "a freed man named Thomas, who'd bought his own freedom years earlier. They're offering serious money for y'all, $2,000. That's enough to tempt even sympathetic folks." "Should we move on?" Marcus asked. Thomas shook his head. "Too dangerous. They're watching the roads. You'll stay here hidden until the patrols move on." They stayed 4 days, cramped in a cellar, listening to footsteps overhead, hearing Thomas lie to the men who came asking questions. On the second day, they heard a voice Josiah recognized, Dutch Calloway. "I know they came this way," Dutch snarled above them. 4 niggers traveling together, one of them named Josiah. Tall, strong, around 30. "You seen them?" "No, sir," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "Haven't seen anyone like that." "You're lying. I can smell lies, old man." The sound of furniture crashing. May grabbed Josiah's arm, her grip tight with fear. If Dutch found them here, Thomas would be arrested or worse for harboring fugitives. The man was risking everything to protect them. "You want to search my home?" Thomas asked, his voice hardening. "I'm a freedman. I got papers. You got no right." A long, tense silence. Then Dutch's voice, cold and venomous. "Watch yourself, old man. Freedom don't mean much when you're harboring criminals." Footsteps, the door slamming, silence. Thomas descended to the cellar an hour later, his face grim. "They're getting closer. We need to move you tonight, before they come back with a warrant." They left after midnight, traveling in Thomas's wagon under a load of grain sacks. Every bump in the road felt like it might reveal them. Every time the wagon slowed, Josiah was certain they'd been caught. But Thomas got them to the next station, a church 40 miles north on the Tennessee border. Freedom was close now. So close Josiah could almost taste it. But close wasn't the same as safe. At the church, a white minister named Reverend Johnston greeted them with grave news. "The governor of Tennessee has agreed to honor Mississippi's bounty. You're not safe even when you cross the border. You need to make it all the way to Ohio before you're truly free." Ohio. Another 150 miles at least. More stations, more risks, more chances to be caught. "We've made it this far," Caleb said quietly. "We can make it the rest of the way." Josiah wasn't sure if that was faith or delusion, but they had no choice except to keep moving. That night, they crossed into Tennessee, leaving Mississippi behind. It should have felt triumphant, but it just felt like moving from one danger to another. The stations in Tennessee were more frequent, but also more dangerous. The state had its own slave catchers, its own patrols, and the Blackwood Fire had made Josiah and his companions infamous enough that even people who'd normally help fugitives thought twice. At one station, a farmer turned them away. "Too dangerous," he said flatly. "Y'all are wanted too bad. I got a family to think about." They spent that night hidden in a forest, cold and hungry, wondering if this was where their luck would finally run out. But the railroad found them again. A young black woman appeared at dawn, silent as a ghost, and led them to another safe house. From there to another. The network held, carried them forward on faith and courage and the simple human decency that still existed even in the darkest times. 2 months after the fire, they reached the Ohio River. Free soil was on the other side, close enough to see, close enough to dream about, but between them and freedom stood one final crossing, one last chance to be caught. The Ohio River flowed dark and cold under a November sky, its surface rippling with currents that could drown a man in minutes. Josiah stood on the Tennessee shore, looking across at the distant lights of Ohio. Free soil, freedom, everything they'd risked their lives for. Less than a mile away, might as well have been 1,000. "The ferries are all watched," their guide explained. A grizzled riverman named Captain Hollis, who'd been moving fugitives for 20 years. "Slave catchers pay the ferry operators to report suspicious passengers. Will cross at night in my boat, where the river bends and the current's strong. It's dangerous, but it's the only way." They waited until after midnight, huddled in an abandoned warehouse near the river, listening to the water and the distant sounds of the town. May was shivering despite the blankets Hollis had provided, and Caleb's leg was infected from a cut he'd gotten days earlier. They were exhausted, half-starved, running on nothing but determination. Marcus sat beside Josiah, both of them silent, thinking about everything that had brought them here. "You ever wonder if it was worth it?" Marcus asked quietly. "The fire, the running, all of this?" Josiah thought about Esther, thought about the 47 names now known across the South, forcing people to confront the human cost of slavery. Thought about Edmund Blackwood's reputation, forever stained with the blood of those he'd let die. "Yes," he said simply, "it was worth it. Even if we don't make it across, even then." At 2 in the morning, Captain Hollis signaled it was time. They crept down to the river where his boat waited, a small, flat-bottomed craft that looked barely capable of handling the current. 4 fugitives, 1 captain, and a prayer that they'd reach the other side alive. "Don't move once we launch," Hollis warned. "The current here is treacherous. One wrong shift and we'll capsize. Trust me to get you across." They pushed off from shore, and immediately the current grabbed them. The boat spun, tilted, and Josiah's stomach lurched as cold water splashed over the sides. Hollis worked the oars with expert precision, fighting the river, angling them toward the Ohio shore. Halfway across, they heard it. The sound of another boat launching behind them, voices shouting orders. "Slave catchers!" Hollis hissed. "Hold on!" He pulled harder on the oars, every muscle straining. The other boat was faster, gaining on them. Josiah could hear Dutch Calloway's voice carrying across the water, could imagine his cruel smile as he closed in on the prey he'd been hunting for months. "We're not going to make it," May whispered, terror in her voice. "Yes, we are," Josiah said firmly. He'd survived a plague. He'd burned down his oppressor's house. He'd traveled hundreds of miles through hostile territory. They were not going to be caught 50 yards from freedom. He grabbed one of the oars from Hollis. "Let me help." Together they pulled with everything they had. The Ohio shore grew closer, 40 yards, 30, 20. Behind them, the slave catchers were gaining, Dutch's voice shouting for them to stop, threatening them with dogs and chains and worse. 10 yards. The boat scraped against mud and rocks. "Go!" Hollis shouted. "Run!" They leaped from the boat into shallow water and stumbled up the Ohio bank. Free soil, Josiah's feet touched ground that was by law free, and something in his chest unlocked. He turned and saw Dutch Calloway's boat still in the river, unable to follow without violating state sovereignty. Dutch stood in his boat, rage contorting his face, his pistol drawn but useless at this distance. "This ain't over!" he screamed across the water. "We'll get you eventually. You can't hide forever." But they didn't need forever. They just needed right now, and right now they were free. Hollis waved from his boat, already pushing back toward the Tennessee shore. The old riverman had done his job, delivered 4 more souls to freedom, and would go back to wait for the next ones who needed crossing. They ran inland, putting distance between themselves and the river, following directions Hollis had given them to the first free soil station, a black church in a small town 10 miles north. They reached it just as dawn broke, collapsing on the church steps, exhausted but alive. The minister who found them, a free black man named Reverend Thomas, helped them inside and gave them food, water, and a place to sleep. "You're safe here," he said. "Ohio is free soil. They can't legally take you back." "Can't legally and won't are different things," Marcus pointed out. "True," Reverend Thomas admitted. "Slave catchers sometimes cross the border illegally, kidnap freed blacks and fugitives, drag them back south. You'll need to be careful. Keep moving north. Canada's even safer than Ohio." But Josiah was done running. He'd kept his promise to Esther. He'd survived. He'd made sure the 47 forgotten souls were remembered. Now he needed to figure out how to live, not just survive. Over the following days, Reverend Thomas helped them adjust to freedom. He connected them with other freed blacks in the community, helped them find work, gave them the papers they'd need to prove their free status. It was strange, this new life. Strange to work and be paid. Strange to walk streets without fear. Strange to sleep without wondering if tonight would be the night they were caught. But strange felt better than slavery. One evening, a newspaper arrived with an article about Blackwood Plantation. Edmund Blackwood was rebuilding, buying new slaves, trying to restore his fortune, but his reputation was ruined. The Blackwood Plague, as it was called, had become a rallying cry for abolitionists. Those 47 names were being repeated in speeches, printed in pamphlets, used as evidence of slavery's inherent cruelty. Josiah read Esther's name in print and felt tears sting his eyes for the first time since she died. She was remembered. They all were. The forgotten had been found, and their stories would outlive Edmund Blackwood's plantation, would outlive slavery itself. "What now?" May asked. She'd found work as a seamstress and was starting to build a life. Caleb had found work as a carpenter. Marcus was planning to save money and try to find his family, to buy their freedom if he could. "Now we live," Josiah said. "We build lives worth living. We remember where we came from and who we lost, but we don't let it destroy us. We survive, and then we learn to thrive." It sounded easier than it was, but it was a start. 6 months after crossing the Ohio River, Josiah had built something resembling a life. He worked at a lumber mill, had a small room in a boarding house, and was learning to exist without constantly looking over his shoulder. But freedom didn't erase the past, and every night he still dreamed of Esther, still saw the mass grave, still felt the weight of those 47 names. Then, one March afternoon, Marcus came to him with news that changed everything. "Dutch Calloway is in Cincinnati." Josiah looked up from the board he was planing, his hands stilling. "What? Dutch Calloway? He's here in Ohio, illegally from what I hear, working with slave catchers who kidnap freed blacks and sell them back into slavery. He's been bragging in taverns about the slaves he let get away, about how he'll catch them eventually." Marcus's expression was grim. "He's hunting us, Josiah. Even here, we're not safe." Josiah felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd thought crossing the river would end it, that Dutch would give up and move on. But Dutch was like the fever, persistent, deadly, and impossible to escape. "Where is he staying?" "The Riverside Inn, near the docks. He's got 3 other men with him, all armed." Marcus studied Josiah's face. "What are you thinking?" What was he thinking? That Dutch Calloway represented everything wrong with the world, that he was a symbol of the system that had murdered Esther and 46 others. That as long as men like Dutch existed, no black person, free or enslaved, would ever be truly safe. "I'm thinking," Josiah said slowly, "that someone needs to stop him." "You mean kill him?" "I mean stop him, however that needs to happen." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You know what they'll do if they catch you. You're already wanted for arson and rebellion. Add murder of a white man, and they'll make an example of you." "I know." Josiah set down his plane and met Marcus's gaze. "But if Dutch is here, hunting freed blacks, selling people back into slavery, how many will suffer because we did nothing? How many families will be destroyed? This isn't your responsibility, isn't it?" Josiah felt anger rising. "We set the fire. We made ourselves visible. We drew attention to the system's cruelty, but that doesn't stop men like Dutch from existing. Someone has to stand up to them." Over the following week, Josiah watched Dutch Calloway. He learned his routines, his habits, where he drank and who he talked to. He learned that Dutch was indeed hunting freed blacks, working with kidnappers who'd grab people off the streets and drag them back south. 3 people had already disappeared, families destroyed, lives stolen. Josiah also learned that Dutch was planning something bigger, a raid on a black church where he believed fugitives were being sheltered. He'd gathered a group of armed men and planned to attack during Sunday service, capture everyone inside, and sort out who was legally free versus who was fugitive later. It was exactly the kind of violence that would terrorize the entire community, that would make even free blacks afraid to gather, afraid to live. Josiah couldn't let it happen. He gathered Marcus, Caleb, and May, along with a few other freed blacks they'd befriended. Dutch is planning a raid, he explained. Sunday, Trinity Church. We can stop him, but it won't be easy or safe. How? Caleb asked. We warn the church, evacuate everyone before he arrives. Then we wait for him. We're legally free here. He's operating illegally, kidnapping citizens. If we catch him in the act with witnesses, the law will have to respond. And if the law doesn't respond? May asked. If they side with him because he's white, then we make sure the story gets out. We make sure people know what he tried to do. We make sure his actions have consequences, one way or another. Sunday arrived grey and cold. Josiah and the others warned Trinity Church's minister, Reverend Davis, who evacuated the congregation through a back entrance while Dutch and his men approached the front. When Dutch burst through the church doors with his armed gang, expecting to find a congregation of frightened people, he found instead a dozen freed black men standing in the pews, waiting, and in the front row, Josiah. Dutch's face went pale, then red with rage. You. Me? Josiah confirmed. Hello, Dutch. Remember me? Remember Blackwood Plantation? Remember the 47 people you let die? You burned down that plantation, you son of a bitch. You're a criminal. You don't have the right to be standing here free. And you're trespassing in a church, planning to kidnap legally free citizens. How's that for criminal? Josiah gestured to the windows, where faces were visible. Reverend Davis had positioned witnesses all around the church. You're being watched, Dutch. Everything you do here will be reported, will be printed in newspapers, so I suggest you leave, now. Dutch looked around, realizing he was trapped. He'd come expecting to overpower vulnerable people. Instead, he'd walked into an ambush, surrounded by witnesses and facing men ready to defend themselves. This isn't over, he snarled. Yes, Josiah said quietly, it is. Go back south, Dutch. Go back to whatever master will still hire you after what you did at Blackwood. But understand this. If you come after any freed black person again, if you try to kidnap anyone, if you even look wrong at someone in this community, I will make sure the whole world knows what kind of man you are. For a long moment, Dutch and Josiah stared at each other, the air crackling with violence barely restrained. Then Dutch spat on the church floor and turned, stalking out with his men. After they left, Reverend Davis approached Josiah, his expression torn between gratitude and concern. You made a dangerous enemy today. I made a dangerous enemy the day I was born black in Mississippi, Josiah replied. At least now he knows we won't be victims anymore. Word of the confrontation spread quickly. Dutch Calloway left Ohio within days, his reputation in the North ruined, his plans to kidnap freed blacks thwarted. It wasn't complete justice. He'd return south and likely continue his cruelty there. But it was something. It was a line drawn, a statement made. We will fight back, we will protect ourselves, we will not be forgotten. Josiah became known in Cincinnati's black community as someone who stood up, who fought back, who protected the vulnerable. People started calling him the avenging angel of the forgotten, a name that made him uncomfortable, but that he couldn't shake. He didn't feel like an angel. He felt like a man who'd survived hell and was trying to make sure others didn't have to experience the same. 2 years passed. Josiah built a fuller life in Cincinnati. He'd been promoted at the lumber mill, saved enough money to rent a small house, even started teaching freed children to read on Sunday afternoons. The nightmares of the fever came less frequently now, though they never entirely stopped. Esther's face still visited him in dreams, still reminded him of everything he'd lost, but he was learning to carry the weight of memory without letting it crush him, learning to honor the dead by living fully, not just surviving. Then, one autumn afternoon in 1858, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was from Samuel Reed, the Natchez preacher who'd first helped them escape. The letter was brief and urgent. "Josiah, Edmund Blackwood is dead. Cholera took him last month. His plantation has been sold, divided up among his creditors. But before he died, he wrote something, a confession of sorts, acknowledging the plague and his negligence. His family tried to suppress it, but I obtained a copy. I thought you should know. The man who let 47 people die has finally faced his own mortality. Perhaps now those souls can rest." Your friend, Samuel Reed Josiah, read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what he felt. He'd imagined Edmund Blackwood's death many times, had pictured elaborate revenges, had dreamed of confronting him, but the reality was mundane. A man dying of disease, just as the people he'd neglected had died. Was it justice? Not really. But it was something. It was closure of a kind. The confession Reed mentioned was eventually published in abolitionist newspapers. It didn't absolve Blackwood. Nothing could. But it acknowledged the truth. 47 people had died because of his neglect, because he valued property over human lives. Their names were real, their suffering was real, and it mattered. Josiah saved the newspaper clipping, folded it carefully, and kept it in the small wooden box where he kept his few precious possessions. Among them was a carved wooden bird he'd made for Esther, the last thing he'd given her before the fever came. He held it sometimes when the memories became too heavy, a physical reminder that love had existed even in the darkest places. One Sunday afternoon, while teaching the children, a young girl named Sarah raised her hand. "Mr. Josiah, is it true you survived a plague?" He looked at her, 7 years old, bright-eyed, free in a way he'd never been at her age. "Yes." "How? How did you survive when so many others died?" It was a question he still asked himself. Why him? Why had death passed him by when it took Esther, took Samuel, took Ruth and 44 others? "I don't know why I survived," he said honestly, "but I know what I had to do afterward. I had to remember everyone who died. I had to make sure their names weren't forgotten, and I had to build a life worth the survival, a life that honored them." "Do you still remember all their names?" Sarah asked. "Every single one." And he did. He could recite all 47 from memory, could picture each face, could remember something specific about each person. It was his burden and his gift to carry them forward, to keep them alive in memory, even though their bodies were dust. That evening, Marcus visited. He'd been working in Cleveland, but came to Cincinnati occasionally to check on old friends. He'd never found his wife and son. They'd been sold too far, disappeared into the vast machinery of slavery. But he'd made peace with it in the way that survivors do, carrying the loss without letting it destroy him. "I heard about Blackwood," Marcus said, sitting on Josiah's small porch as the sun set. "How do you feel?" "I don't know," Josiah admitted. "I thought his death would feel like victory, but mostly it just feels sad. All that cruelty, all that suffering, and for what? He died anyway, like everyone does. The plantation's gone. The system continues without him. But the story lives on," Marcus pointed out. "Those 47 names are in history now. People know what happened. That matters, Josiah. You made it matter." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 men who'd survived hell and were slowly learning to live in the world beyond it. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked eventually. "Starting the fire?" Josiah thought about it honestly. He'd taken a path that led to violence, to destruction, to becoming something harder and colder than he'd been before, but he'd also ensured that 47 people weren't forgotten, that their deaths weren't meaningless, that Edmund Blackwood's cruelty was exposed and recorded. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. I regret that it was necessary. I regret the world that made it necessary. But I don't regret making sure they were remembered." The abolitionist movement was growing stronger. John Brown had just led his raid on Harper's Ferry, and the country was fracturing along lines of slave and free. War was coming. Anyone paying attention could see it. And when it came, the stories of people like those 47 forgotten souls would fuel it, would remind people what they were fighting for. Josiah wouldn't live to see slavery end. He died in 1863, during the middle of the Civil War, of pneumonia contracted while helping escaped slaves reach Canada. But before he died, he wrote down every name, every story he could remember about the people who'd died in the Blackwood Plague. He gave it to Reverend Davis, asking him to preserve it, to make sure future generations knew what had happened. That document still exists, housed in a Cincinnati museum. 47 names, each with a small note, what they loved, what they dreamed of, how they died. A memorial in words for people who never got a proper grave. And at the end, in Josiah's handwriting, "I was the one who survived. This is my testimony. Remember us, all of us, and build a world where this never happens again." The war came, as everyone knew it would. The nation tore itself apart over the question of slavery, and the blood of hundreds of thousands was spilled before the answer was finally written into law. Josiah didn't live to see it, but his story did. The Blackwood Plague became a rallying cry during the war. Abolitionists pointed to it as evidence of slavery's inherent cruelty, of the fundamental disregard for black lives that the system required. Those 47 names were repeated in speeches, printed in pamphlets, carved into monuments after the war ended. May lived until 1889, long enough to see Reconstruction rise and fall, long enough to see the brief promise of freedom give way to new forms of oppression, but she never stopped telling the story. She'd gather children around her, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, neighborhood kids, and tell them about the fever, about Josiah's courage, about the fire that brought justice and memory to the forgotten. Caleb became a minister, founding a church in Cleveland that became a center for freed blacks, establishing themselves in the North. He preached about survival, about resilience, about remembering where you came from while building toward where you were going. He kept Esther's name alive in his sermons, kept all 47 names alive, making sure every new generation knew the cost of the freedom they enjoyed. Marcus never found his wife and son, but he helped dozens of other families reunite, working with the Freedmen's Bureau after the war to track down separated family members. He died in 1870, still searching, still believing that family was worth fighting for, and Josiah became legend. The slave who survived the plantation plague and returned as the avenging angel of the forgotten. His story was told and retold, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always carrying the essential truth. One man refused to let the forgotten stay forgotten. The mass grave at Blackwood Plantation was eventually marked with a proper memorial, erected in 1868 by freed blacks from across Mississippi who came together to honor the dead. 47 names carved in stone, finally given the recognition they'd been denied in life. The inscription reads, "They lived, they suffered, they died, and one survivor made sure we would remember." Esther's name is first on the list because Josiah requested it that way in his written testimony. After her name, 46 others, each one a complete person, each one carrying dreams and hopes and loves that were cut short. The story of the Blackwood Plague has echoed through generations. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, activists referenced it as historical precedent for resistance. During the 2020s, when conversations about racial justice intensified, historians revisited Josiah's story, examining what it meant to fight for dignity and remembrance in a system designed to erase you. Some see Josiah as a hero, a man who struck back against tyranny and ensured justice for the forgotten. Others see him as a tragic figure, forced into violence by a system that left no room for peaceful resistance. Both interpretations carry truth. What's undeniable is that he kept his promise. He survived. He made sure the 47 weren't forgotten, and he built a life that, despite everything, had meaning and purpose. Today, if you visit Cincinnati, you can find a small museum dedicated to the Underground Railroad. In it, there's a section about the Blackwood Plague, with Josiah's handwritten testimony preserved behind glass. Visitors read those 47 names, learn their stories, and carry their memory forward. Esther, who loved to sing while she worked and dreamed of a world where her children would be free. Samuel, who married people and spoke blessings even in bondage. Ruth, who was 5 years old and loved the wooden animals Josiah carved for her. And 44 others, each one a universe of experience and emotion, each one mattering. The plague tried to erase them, slavery tried to make them invisible, but Josiah, through fire and fury and an unbreakable will to remember, made sure they would live on. That's the real story of the avenging angel of the forgotten. Not the violence, not the revenge, but the memory. The fierce, stubborn insistence that every life matters, that every name deserves to be spoken, that the forgotten will be found and honored. In the museum, next to Josiah's testimony, there's one final piece, a carved wooden bird, simple but beautiful, made by hands that knew hard labor but also knew love. It was found among his possessions when he died, labeled with a single word, Esther. He carried her memory until his last breath. He carried all their memories. And now, generations later, we carry them too. The forgotten are forgotten no more. Their names echo through history, a testament to one man's promise and the 47 lives that deserved to be remembered. They lived, they suffered, they died, but they were not erased. And that, in the end, is what justice looks like. Not perfect, not complete, but real. The recognition that lives matter, that names matter, that memory is a form of resurrection. Josiah understood this. He lived it. And through his testimony, through his courage, through his refusal to let the dead disappear, he ensured that the Blackwood Plague would never be forgotten. The story ends, but the memory continues. 47 names, carved in stone and written in history. 47 souls who mattered then and matter now. Remember them. Remember Josiah. Remember that even in the darkest moments, resistance is possible, justice is possible, memory is possible. And sometimes survival itself is the greatest act of defiance.